Touch her again, I dare you!
The words came from the janitor, the man in the yellow gloves everyone ignored. Preston Hawthorne, billionaire untouchable, turned with murderous eyes. His pregnant wife lay on the floor, blood on her lip, fear in her eyes. And Scott Bailey, who had nothing, stood between them. "You just ended your life," Preston hissed. But Scott didn't move, because some things are worth losing everything for. But before we see what happens next, subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, let me tell you how a janitor made the choice that would destroy a billionaire. Before that night, Scott Bailey never imagined he would become known. He only wanted to get through each day. Each morning was the same routine, the same struggle, the same quiet desperation masked by a father's determination to give his son a normal life. At 5 in the morning, as always, Scott woke up in his small one-bedroom apartment in Oak Cliff, a neighborhood few chose to live in, but for him it was all he could afford. The alarm on his phone pierced the darkness with its insistent beeping. He reached over, fumbling in the dim light, and turned it off. For a moment, he lay there in the silence, staring at the water-stained ceiling, gathering the strength to face another day. The apartment was small, painfully small. The living room doubled as Scott's bedroom. His mattress lay on the floor in the corner, covered with a thin blanket and a pillow that had lost most of its stuffing years ago. The walls were bare, except for a faded calendar from 2 years ago that he'd never bothered to take down. The carpet was worn thin, showing the concrete underneath in places where feet had walked the same path too many times. But it was home, the only home he could afford. Scott pushed himself up, his back aching from sleeping on the floor. He was 32, but some mornings he felt 50. He walked quietly to the tiny bathroom, barely big enough to turn around in, and splashed cold water on his face. The mirror showed a man he barely recognized, short, dark brown hair that needed cutting, light stubble he couldn't afford to shave every day, warm brown eyes with dark circles underneath that never seemed to fade, no matter how much he slept. He looked tired. He was tired, tired in his bones, in his soul. But Caleb needed him, and that was enough to keep going. Scott walked to the bunk bed in the corner of the single bedroom. He'd bought it second-hand 3 years ago when Sarah left. It was supposed to be temporary, just until he got back on his feet. But 3 years later, here they still were. Caleb slept on the top bunk, his small body curled up under a Spider-Man blanket, clutching a worn-out teddy bear with one ear missing most of its fur. Beery. That's what Caleb had named him when he was 2 years old. Beery had been through everything with Caleb. The divorce, the move, the hard nights when Caleb woke up crying for his mother. The bear was falling apart now, stuffing coming out of several seams, but Caleb refused to let Scott throw it away. "Beery's my best friend," Caleb had said once, and Scott understood. Sometimes you hold on to things not because they're perfect, but because they're familiar. Because when everything else changes, at least one thing stays the same. Scott made breakfast in the kitchenette, a tiny corner with a 2-burner stove, a mini-fridge, and a sink perpetually stained no matter how much he scrubbed it. Not pancakes or bacon like on TV, not the kind of breakfast he'd grown up eating, back when his own father worked construction and his mother stayed home and made homemade biscuits every Sunday. Just cereal with milk. The generic brand from the dollar store, in a bag instead of a box. Sometimes a slice of toast if they had bread. He poured the cereal into 2 bowls, added milk that would expire tomorrow, and set them on the small folding table that served as their dining area. Then he walked back to the bedroom and gently shook Caleb's shoulder. "Hey, buddy, time to wake up." Caleb groaned and rolled over, burying his face in Beery's matted fur. "5 more minutes, Dad." "Can't do 5 more minutes, champ. You've got school. Come on." Caleb slowly sat up, rubbing his eyes with small fists. His dark brown hair stuck up in every direction. He had freckles across his nose and bright brown eyes that reminded Scott painfully of Sarah. But where Sarah's eyes had been calculating, always looking for something better, something easier, Caleb's were innocent, trusting, full of a child's simple love that asked for nothing but to be loved in return. Scott helped him down from the bunk bed and handed him his clothes. Jeans with a patch on one knee that Scott had sewn himself, a t-shirt with a faded superhero logo that used to be Caleb's favorite until the colors washed out, mismatched socks because the dryer in the apartment building's basement had eaten half their pairs over the years. Caleb got dressed slowly, still half asleep, while Scott combed his hair and made sure his backpack had everything he needed for school. A pencil case with 3 pencils and 1 eraser worn down to almost nothing. A folder with his homework. Math problems Scott had helped him with last night at this same folding table. A lunchbox with his name written on it in permanent marker. They ate breakfast together in silence. Scott watched Caleb eat, making sure he finished every bite. The boy was too thin. They both were. But there was only so much Scott could afford on what the Indigo House paid him for night shifts. $12 an hour, 40 hours a week if he was lucky. Sometimes they needed him less, sometimes more, but it averaged out to just barely enough to cover rent, utilities and food. Nothing left over for extras. Nothing left over for things like new shoes when Caleb's got too small, or a haircut when Scott's hair got too long, or pizza on a Thursday night. "Dad, can we have pizza today?" The question hit Scott like a punch to the gut. It was such a small request. Such a normal thing for a 7-year-old to want. Pizza, just pizza. Most kids probably had it once a week without thinking twice about it, but Scott had $12 in his bank account, and payday wasn't until Friday. $12 had to cover gas for his truck, and maybe some milk and bread to get them through the week. "Next week, I promise." The words tasted like failure in his mouth. Another promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Another next week added to the pile of all the other next weeks he'd promised over the past 3 years. Caleb didn't complain. He never did. He just nodded and kept eating his cereal, his little legs swinging under the too big chair. He was used to next week promises, used to his father's tired face, used to the apartment that was too small and the clothes that were too worn, and the knowledge that they didn't have much, used to his mother's absence, Sarah, Caleb's mother. She had left 3 years ago, chasing an easier life with a man she'd met at a bar. Since that day, Scott's world had collapsed like a house of cards in a windstorm. He'd lost his wife, lost his job as an electrical technician after too many absences caring for his son when daycare fell through. Lost the house they'd been halfway through paying off. The bank had foreclosed 6 months after Sarah left, when Scott could no longer make the mortgage payments on unemployment checks. Lost everything except the 2 things that mattered: Caleb and his determination to be the father his son deserved. All that remained was him and Caleb, and a mountain of bills that never seemed to get smaller no matter how hard he worked. Scott had knocked on every door looking for work in those desperate first months after losing the house. He'd applied to construction companies. His background was in electrical work. He knew his way around a job site. But they wanted someone without complications, someone who could work overtime without notice, someone who didn't have to leave at 3:30 to pick up a kid from school. He'd tried retail, fast food, warehouses, anything that would pay, but everywhere he went, it was the same story. "We'll call you." They never did. His savings had run out. The severance from his old job, 2 weeks' pay, had evaporated paying for the security deposit on this apartment. He'd sold everything they owned that had any value, Sarah's jewelry that she'd left behind, his tools, the TV, the furniture. all of it gone to keep them fed for a few more weeks. He was 3 days away from being homeless when he saw the posting at a gas station. Janitorial position available. Night shift. Indigo House. Apply in person. Scott had driven there that same day, walked in through the service entrance wearing the only clean shirt he had left, filled out an application with shaking hands, terrified they'd ask questions he couldn't answer. The facilities manager, a tired-looking man named Marcus, had barely looked at him. "You got reliable transportation?" "Yes, sir." "You okay working nights? 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. "Yes, sir." "You don't mind hard work? Mopping, trash, cleaning bathrooms, dealing with whatever messes people leave?" "No, sir. I'll do whatever you need." Marcus had studied him for a moment. Then he'd nodded. "You start Monday, 12 an hour. Bring your own work boots." Scott had wanted to cry. $12 an hour was nothing compared to what he'd made as an electrician, but it was something. It was a lifeline when he was drowning. "Thank you," he'd said. "Thank you so much." And for 3 years he'd shown up every night. Never late, never called in sick, never complained. Because this job, as humble as it was, as invisible as it made him, was all that stood between him and Caleb living in his truck. Each night he dropped Caleb off with Mrs. Regina, the elderly Mexican neighbor downstairs. She was 68, a widow who'd lived in the building for 20 years. She had warm, dark brown eyes and soft hands that smelled like the cinnamon cookies she baked for Caleb. Her apartment was small but filled with warmth. Colorful blankets on the couch, pictures of her grandchildren on the walls, the constant smell of something delicious cooking on the stove. She never took money for watching Caleb. Scott had tried. That first night he'd offered her $20, money he couldn't afford to spare, but felt obligated to give. She'd pushed it back into his hands. "Keep your money, mijo. I like having the sound of a child in the house. Go work. Don't worry. He'll be safe with me." And he was. Every night Scott would drop Caleb off at 8:30. Mrs. Regina would already have the couch made up with blankets and pillows. She'd feed Caleb dinner, always something better than Scott could afford. Homemade tortillas, rice and beans, sometimes even chicken. She'd help him with his homework, let him watch cartoons, tuck him in when he fell asleep. And every morning when Scott came to pick him up at 5:30, exhausted and smelling of industrial cleaner, she'd have coffee ready, would ask how his night went, would tell him Caleb was a good boy, so smart, so sweet. Scott was grateful to the point of speechlessness. He didn't know how to put into words what her kindness meant. That in a world that had been cruel and cold, that had taken everything from him, here was one person who asked for nothing and gave everything. But he never said much. He didn't have the words. Only nodded, thanked her quietly, and carried his sleeping son back upstairs to their apartment. Then he'd drive his 15-year-old pickup through Dallas's quiet streets to the Indigo House, watching the sun rise over a city that belonged to people with more money than he'd ever have. At the Indigo House, Scott learned how to become invisible. He learned to mop floors without making a sound, to empty trash bins so quietly that no one realized he had passed by, to lower his gaze when guests walked in, and to never look anyone in the eyes. He had seen everything: drunken men shouting at waitstaff, women in designer dresses whispering gossip about colleagues, threats, inappropriate touches, hollow laughter. And Scott, he acted like he saw nothing, because he needed this job, because Caleb needed food, school, a home, because no one cared about a janitor's feelings. But that night, the night Nova Hawthorne fell to the floor, one hand clutching her pregnant belly, blood at her lips, something inside Scott broke. He thought of Sarah, of the months she carried Caleb, her belly huge, her steps heavy, but her eyes glowing with joy. He remembered how he used to help her up the stairs, how he'd rest his hand on her stomach each night, whispering small promises. No one should ever hit a pregnant woman, no one, no matter how rich. And Scott stepped out of the shadows. He didn't feel brave. He was trembling, terrified. Scott wasn't a hero. He was just a father. But that night he chose to do what he wanted his son to learn. Caleb was all Scott had left. Not just all he had, all he was. Every decision he made, every sacrifice, every exhausted morning and sleepless night, it was all for that little boy with the bright brown eyes and freckled nose. Each morning when he saw his son wake, he saw Sarah's eyes in those brown ones. The same warm color, the same shape. But everything else was different. Sarah's eyes had been sharp, calculating, always searching for the next better thing. Caleb's eyes were soft, trusting, full of unconditional love that Scott knew he didn't deserve but received anyway, every single day. Each time Caleb laughed, a sound that was becoming rarer as the years wore on and their circumstances didn't improve, Scott heard echoes of better times. Heard the ghost of the family they used to be, back when Sarah still smiled at him, back when they had a house with a backyard, back when Scott's biggest worry was whether they could afford the vacation to Disney World they'd promised Caleb for his 5th birthday. They never made it to Disney World. Sarah left 2 months before Caleb turned 5. The birthday party had been at Mrs. Regina's apartment, with a cake from the grocery store and 3 kids from Caleb's class, whose parents Scott barely knew. Caleb had smiled and said thank you, and acted like it was the best party ever. But Scott had seen the disappointment in his eyes when he asked, "Is Mommy coming?" And Scott had to say, "No, buddy, she can't make it." She could have. She just didn't want to. And that was a truth Caleb was too young to understand, but old enough to feel. The boy knew his father worked hard, knew that when other kids' dads came to pick them up from school in the afternoon, his dad was sleeping, exhausted from working all night, knew that when other families went on vacations or ate at restaurants or bought new toys, they stayed home and played with the same worn-out action figures Caleb had had for years. Once at school, Caleb drew a picture during art class. The teacher, Mrs. Morrison, had called Scott about it. "Mr. Bailey, I wanted to share something with you. Caleb drew this today and I thought you should see it." It was a crayon drawing, the kind 7-year-olds make, all stick figures and bright colors and crooked letters. But what it showed made Scott's chest tight. A man with short brown hair, wearing a navy uniform, pushing a cleaning cart with a mop sticking out. And beside him, much smaller, a little boy with messy hair holding the man's hand. Above it, in Caleb's unsteady handwriting, the words, "Dad is my hero." Scott had stared at that drawing for a long time, sitting in his truck in the school parking lot after Mrs. Morrison handed it to him. His eyes had filled with tears. He'd blinked away furiously. Because he wasn't a hero. Heroes saved people. Heroes won. Heroes didn't sleep on mattresses on the floor and promised their kids pizza they couldn't afford. But to Caleb, he was, and that meant everything. Scott pinned that drawing to the fridge with a magnet shaped like Texas that had come with the apartment. Every night before leaving for work, he looked at it, let his fingers trace over the crooked letters, reminded himself why he got up every morning, even when his body ached and his bank account was empty and the future looked like nothing but more of the same, struggling, surviving, barely making it. I have to keep going. For him. Because Caleb deserved better than this. Deserved a father who could give him more than generic cereal and second-hand clothes and next week promises. But since Scott couldn't give him those things, he could at least give him everything else. Love, time, presence. The knowledge that no matter what happened, no matter how hard things got, his dad would always be there. Always fighting, always trying, always loving him with a fierceness that made up for everything they didn't have. But that night, When he stepped into that room full of silence and saw Nova Hawthorne on the floor with blood on her lip and fear in her eyes, Scott wasn't thinking about himself. He wasn't thinking about his job or his paycheck or the consequences of speaking up. He was thinking about Caleb. He asked himself, if my son saw me stay silent right now, what would he learn? He'd learn that it's okay to look away when someone's being hurt, that it's smart to stay quiet when speaking up might cost you something, that invisible people should stay invisible, that powerless people should accept their powerlessness, that the world is divided into those who matter and those who don't. And Scott Bailey, for all his failures, for all the ways he'd fallen short as a father, knew he couldn't teach his son that. Scott Bailey didn't want his son to learn silence. He wanted him to learn courage. To learn that doing the right thing matters more than doing the easy thing. That standing up for someone who can't stand up for themselves is worth the cost, whatever that cost might be, even if it meant losing everything. Again, because the drawing on his fridge said, "Dad is my hero," and heroes don't walk away. If you were Scott, standing in that room filled with the powerful, would you stay silent or step forward? Because what happened next changed his life forever. That night, the Indigo House glittered like a painting. Crystal chandeliers scattered light across the grand hall, shimmering over tables draped in spotless white linen and vases of deep red roses. Guests wore Tom Ford suits, Versace gowns, Patek Philippe, watches gleaming on their wrists. They laughed, clinked glasses, and talked about multi-million-dollar deals as casually as afternoon shopping. In the back hallway near the kitchen, Scott Bailey stood quietly, waiting for the crowd to thin before beginning his shift. From where he stood, the music and laughter drifted through, a dazzling world he didn't belong to. Cole Bennett, head chef of the Indigo House, stepped out, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Scott, tonight's going to be a long one. They just added 50 more guests. Brace yourself." Scott nodded. "It's fine. I'm ready." Cole looked at him, recognizing the exhaustion behind those words. The two had known each other for 2 years. They'd started working there around the same time. Cole often slipped Scott some leftovers to take home for Caleb. They didn't talk much, but there was a quiet respect between two men carrying the same weight. "Head home early if you can," Cole said softly. "Your boy's probably waiting." Scott smiled in gratitude. "Yeah, thanks, man." But that night, Scott wouldn't make it home early. At 10:30 p.m., the gala was in full swing. The grand hall was packed. Laughter bounced off marble walls. Champagne flowed. The charity auction had just ended. A Rolex sold for $85,000. A weekend in the Hamptons for $120,000. All for the children, they said. All for a good cause. Scott pushed his cart through the side hallways, collecting discarded napkins, empty glasses, trash people left behind without thinking. He was good at being invisible. So good that when he entered the East Wing Lounge, a smaller, more private room reserved for VIPs, no one even glanced his way. That's where he saw them. Preston Hawthorne stood near the window, a glass of scotch in his hand. He was 45, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair slicked back perfectly. His suit probably cost more than Scott made in 6 months. Everything about Preston screamed power, control, untouchable. Beside him stood Nova Parker Hawthorne. She was 28, petite, delicate. Her dark hair was pinned up elegantly, revealing a slender neck adorned with a diamond necklace that caught the light with every breath. She wore a deep green gown that draped softly over her visibly pregnant belly, maybe 6 months along. But it wasn't her beauty that struck Scott. It was her eyes, tired, afraid, hollow. Preston was speaking to her in a low, controlled voice. Scott couldn't hear the words from across the room, but he could see the tension in Nova's posture, the way her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in front of her. Then Preston's voice rose, just a little, but enough. "I told you to smile, Nova. This is embarrassing." "I'm trying," she whispered. I don't feel well." "You never feel well. You're always complaining. Preston, please. Don't please me. You're making me look weak in front of these people." Scott should have kept moving, should have emptied the trash and left. But something made him stop, made him watch. Nova's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry. I'm trying. I just need a moment." Preston's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, hard. Nova winced, her face twisting in pain. "Let go," she said quietly. "You're hurting me." "Good. Maybe you'll remember to behave next time." Scott's hands tightened on the handle of his cart. His heart pounded in his chest. "Walk away," a voice in his head said. "This isn't your business. You'll lose your job. You'll lose everything." But then Nova stumbled. Preston had shoved her, not hard enough to knock her down, but enough to make her catch herself against the wall. Her hand instinctively went to her belly, protective, terrified, and Scott saw red. He didn't think. He just moved. "Sir," Scott's voice cut through the room. "Please stop. She's pregnant." Preston's head snapped toward him. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Preston's expression shifted, from surprise to cold fury. "Excuse me?" Preston's voice was ice. "Who the hell are you?" "I work here, sir, and I'm asking you to please stop." Preston let go of Nova's wrist and took a step toward Scott. "You work here, so you're a janitor." "Yes, sir." "And you think you have the right to tell me what to do?" Scott's throat was dry. Every instinct screamed at him to back down, to apologize, to disappear. But then he looked at Nova. She was staring at him with wide, disbelieving eyes, like she couldn't believe someone had actually spoken up. "I'm not telling you what to do, sir," Scott said carefully. "I'm just asking you to stop hurting her." Preston laughed, a short, cruel sound. "Hurting her? This is my wife. What happens between us is none of your concern." "She's pregnant," Scott repeated. "That makes it everyone's concern." The room had gone completely silent now. Other guests had started to notice the confrontation. They stood in the doorway, watching, but no one stepped forward. No one said a word. Preston's eyes narrowed. "You have no idea who you're talking to, do you?" "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Hawthorne, and I know this is wrong." For a moment, Preston just stared at him. Then he smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "You're fired." Scott's stomach dropped, but he didn't move. "That's your choice, sir, but I'm not leaving until I know she's safe." "Safe?" Preston's voice dripped with contempt. "From me? I'm her husband. I provide everything for her. This house, my money. That dress, my money. The baby she's carrying, mine. She belongs to me." "No one belongs to anyone," Scott said quietly. Preston's face flushed with rage. He took another step forward, close enough now that Scott could smell the scotch on his breath. "You think you're a hero? You think anyone here cares what a janitor thinks?" Scott glanced around the room. The other guests, men in expensive suits, women dripping in jewelry, all looked away. Uncomfortable, embarrassed, but silent. "I don't need them to care," Scott said. "I just need to know I did the right thing." Preston's hand shot out and grabbed Scott by the collar, yanking him forward. "Listen to me, you piece of trash. I will destroy you. I will make sure you never work in this city again. I will—" "Mr. Hawthorne." A new voice, calm and authoritative, cut through the tension. Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway was Richard Caldwell, the Indigo House's owner. He was 70, grey-haired, impeccably dressed, and he was looking at Preston with an expression of barely concealed disgust. "Let him go," Richard said quietly. Preston hesitated. Then, slowly, he released Scott's collar. Richard stepped into the room. "I think it's time for you to leave, Preston." Preston's eyes widened. "You're throwing me out? Do you have any idea how much money I've donated to this place?" "I'm well aware," Richard said. "And I'm also aware that you just assaulted a member of my staff and publicly mistreated your pregnant wife. So yes, I'm asking you to leave." Preston's face turned purple with fury. "You'll regret this, Caldwell. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of establishment you run here." "I'll take my chances." Richard's voice was ice. "Security will escort you out." 2 security guards appeared in the doorway. Preston looked around the room one last time, at the silent guests, at Nova still standing against the wall, at Scott standing beside his cleaning cart. "This isn't over," Preston hissed. Then he turned and walked out, the security guards following close behind. The room exhaled collectively. Guests began to murmur, whispering among themselves. Richard walked over to Nova. "Mrs. Hawthorne, are you all right?" Nova nodded shakily. "Yes, thank you." Richard turned to Scott. "And you, what's your name?" "Scott Bailey, sir." "Well, Scott Bailey, you have more courage than anyone else in this room tonight. Thank you." Scott nodded, unable to speak. Richard looked around at the other guests. "The rest of you should be ashamed of yourselves. A janitor had to teach you what decency looks like." Then he turned and walked out, leaving the room in stunned silence. Slowly, the guests began to disperse, murmuring uncomfortably. Within minutes, the room was empty except for Scott and Nova. Nova walked toward him slowly. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. "Thank you," she whispered. No one's ever stood up for me like that." "Are you okay?" Scott asked. "Do you need a doctor?" "I'm okay, just shaken." She looked down at her belly, her hand resting protectively over it. "He's been like this for years, but it's gotten worse since I got pregnant. He says I'm not attractive anymore, that I embarrass him." Scott's jaw tightened. "That's not true, and even if it were, that's no excuse to hurt you." Nova looked up at him. "You're going to lose your job because of me." "I already lost it. Preston fired me, remember?" "I'm so sorry. Don't be. I'd do it again." Nova smiled, a small, sad smile. "Why? You don't even know me." Scott thought about Caleb, about the drawing on his fridge, about the kind of man he wanted to be for his son. Because it was the right thing to do. Nova's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to leave him. I don't have money of my own, no job, nowhere to go, and the baby." "There are places that can help," Scott said gently. "Shelters, legal aid. You don't have to stay with him. He'll find me. He always finds me." Her voice broke. "I tried to leave once, 2 years ago. He hired private investigators. They found me in 3 days. He told me if I ever tried again, he'd make sure I lost everything, even the baby." Scott's heart ached for her. "He can't do that. There are laws. Not for men like Preston. He owns judges, lawyers, politicians. He can do whatever he wants." Nova wiped her eyes. "I'm sorry. You've done so much already. I shouldn't burden you with this." "It's not a burden," Scott said. "Look, I don't have much, but I have a friend, a lawyer who does pro bono work. Let me call her. Maybe she can help." Nova looked at him like he'd offered her the world. "You'd do that? For me?" "Of course." She reached out and squeezed his hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Scott squeezed back. "It's going to be okay, I promise." But even as he said it, he wondered if he could keep that promise, because men like Preston Hawthorne didn't lose. They destroyed anyone who got in their way, and Scott Bailey had just made himself a target. The next morning, Scott woke up with a pit in his stomach. He'd lost his job. Rent was due in 2 weeks. Caleb needed new shoes. And he'd just promised a stranger he'd help her escape a billionaire. What the hell had he been thinking? He made Caleb breakfast in silence, his mind racing. Caleb chattered happily about school, about a science project he was working on, but Scott barely heard him. After dropping Caleb at school, Scott sat in his truck in the parking lot and pulled out his phone. He stared at the contact for Elena Rodriguez, a lawyer he'd met years ago when he was going through his divorce. She'd helped him for free, told him to call if he ever needed anything. He'd never called, until now. Eleanor picked up on the second ring. "Scott, is that you?" "Yeah." "Hey, Elena. I need your help." "Of course. What's going on?" Scott told her everything about the gala, about Nova, about Preston Hawthorne. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end. "Scott," Elena said finally, "do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into?" "I know it's complicated." "It's not complicated. It's suicide. Preston Hawthorne is one of the most powerful men in Texas. He has lawyers on retainer who make more in a day than I make in a year. If you help his wife leave him, he will come after you with everything he's got." "I know, but I can't just do nothing." Elena sighed. "You're a good man, Scott. Too good." "Okay. Here's what we do. I'll meet with her. Privately. No paper trail. We'll figure out her options. But Scott, you need to be careful. Men like Hawthorne don't play fair." "I know. Thank you, Elena." "Don't thank me yet. This is going to get ugly." Scott hung up and sat in his truck, staring at the elementary school in front of him. Through the windows he could see Caleb's classroom. His son, laughing with friends, blissfully unaware that his father had just made a choice that could destroy their lives. But Scott couldn't regret it. Not when he thought about Nova's terrified eyes, about her hand on her pregnant belly, about the way no one else in that room had said a word. If Caleb ever asked him what he did when he saw someone in trouble, Scott wanted to be able to say, "I helped," even if it cost him everything. That afternoon, Scott met Nova at a small coffee shop in a quiet part of town. She'd texted him that morning. She'd gotten his number from Richard Caldwell. She wore sunglasses and a simple dress, her hair pulled back. She looked nervous. "Thank you for coming," she said as she slid into the booth across from him. "Of course. How are you?" "Scared. Preston was furious when he got home last night. He didn't hit me, but he said things. Awful things." Her voice shook. "He said if I embarrass him again, he'll make sure I regret it." Scott's hands clenched into fists under the table. "You don't have to go back to him." "I don't have a choice." "You do. I called my lawyer friend. Her name's Elena. She's willing to meet with you, help you figure out a plan." Nova's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really. She does this kind of work all the time. She knows how to handle cases like yours." "Cases like mine," Nova repeated softly. "You mean abused wives?" Scott nodded. "I'm sorry. I know that's hard to hear." "It's true, though." Nova looked down at her coffee, her fingers wrapped around the warm cup like it was the only solid thing in a shifting world. "I didn't always see it. For the longest time, I didn't even have a word for what was happening to me. I thought it was my fault, that I wasn't good enough, that if I could just be better, he'd stop being angry." She took a shaky breath. "At first, Preston was charming, more than charming. He was perfect, romantic, attentive. He swept me off my feet so fast I didn't know what hit me. I was 23, working as a receptionist at a medical office, making $11 an hour, living in a studio apartment with 2 roommates, eating ramen for dinner most nights. And then this man walks in, this handsome, powerful, successful man in a suit that probably cost more than my car, and he looks at me like I'm the most interesting person he's ever seen." Nova's eyes were distant now, lost in the memory. He came back every day for a week, always found an excuse to talk to me, to make me laugh, to ask about my day like he genuinely cared. Then he asked me out, took me to the nicest restaurant I'd ever been to, treated me like I was special, like I mattered. I'd never felt like that before. My family wasn't wealthy. My dad left when I was 6. My mum worked 2 jobs to keep us fed. I grew up wearing hand-me-downs and shopping at thrift stores, and suddenly here was this man who wanted to buy me designer dresses and take me to galas and introduce me to Dallas high society. I thought I was Cinderella. I thought I'd won the lottery. Scott listened without interrupting, his heart aching for the young woman she'd been, the one who'd thought she was being rescued when she was really being trapped. We got married 6 months after we met. Looking back, that should have been a red flag. But I was so in love, so caught up in the fairy tale, I didn't question it. The wedding was like something out of a magazine. 300 guests, a dress that cost $15,000, a honeymoon in Paris. I kept thinking, this can't be real. This can't be my life. When did it change? Nova was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller, younger. The night we got back from our honeymoon, we had a dinner party at our house. Preston's house, I should say. It was never really mine. His business partners and their wives. I was nervous. I wanted to make a good impression. I'd spent all day cooking, getting everything perfect. But I made a mistake. I served the wine wrong, poured it too full, I think. One of the wives made a comment about it, laughing like it was a joke. Everyone laughed, and I laughed too, embarrassed, said something like, "I'm still learning." Preston smiled, laughed along with everyone else, but I could see it in his eyes. The anger, the humiliation. He felt I'd made him look bad in front of his colleagues, that I'd embarrassed him by not knowing something a proper wife should know. Nova's hands were shaking now. Scott wanted to reach across the table to take her hand, but he didn't. Let her tell her story at her own pace. After everyone left, he didn't say a word, just walked past me like I wasn't there, went upstairs. I cleaned up the whole dinner by myself, terrified, not knowing what I'd done wrong. When I finally went upstairs, he was sitting on the bed, and he said, "You embarrassed me tonight." I apologized, tried to explain that I didn't know, that I'd do better next time, and he said, "You need to be more careful. People are watching you now. You represent me. If you make me look bad, there will be consequences." Consequences. Nova's laugh was bitter. That was his word for it. Consequences, like I was a child being punished for misbehaving. After we got married, little things at first, he'd criticize what I wore, tell me that dress made me look cheap, that hairstyle was too young for someone who needed to look sophisticated. He'd ask me to change clothes 3-4 times before we went out. And I did. I wanted to please him, wanted to be the wife he deserved. Then it was the way I talked. Too loud at parties, too quiet at dinners, laughing at the wrong things, not laughing enough. I started watching him constantly, trying to read his mood, trying to anticipate what he wanted before he asked. But I could never get it right. There was always something wrong with me. He started controlling what I ate, said I needed to watch my figure, that men like him were expected to have beautiful wives, so I stopped eating regular meals, started surviving on salads and black coffee, lost 15 pounds in 3 months. People told me I looked great. Preston told me I could still lose 5 more. She paused, her voice breaking. The first time he hit me was a year into our marriage. He'd had a bad day at work. Some deal fell through. He came home angry, poured himself a drink. I asked him what was wrong, if there was anything I could do to help, and he just snapped. Backhanded me across the face so hard I fell. Scott's jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists under the table. I was so shocked. I just sat there on the floor, holding my face, not understanding what had just happened. And then he started crying, got down on his knees, said he was so sorry, he didn't know what came over him, he'd never do it again. He held me and cried and begged me to forgive him, said the stress was getting to him, but it would never, ever happen again. He apologized after, cried, said it would never happen again, and I believed him. Nova's voice was bitter now. I believed him because I wanted to, because admitting that my husband had just hit me meant admitting that my fairy tale was a lie, that I'd made a terrible mistake, and I wasn't ready to admit that. So I forgave him, and for a few weeks he was perfect again, brought me flowers, took me to dinner, told me how much he loved me. I thought we were past it, thought it was just a one-time thing. But it did happen again, and again. Sometimes it was because I'd done something wrong, or what he considered wrong. Sometimes it was because he'd had a bad day and I was just there, convenient to take his anger out on. He hit me where it wouldn't show, my ribs, my back, places I could hide with clothes. And between the hitting there was the rest of it, the constant criticism, the isolation. He didn't like my friends, said they were beneath us now, so I stopped seeing them. He didn't like me working, said it looked bad for a man of his position to have a wife who needed a job. So I quit. He controlled all the money, gave me an allowance like I was a child. If I spent too much, he'd get angry. If I asked for more, he'd lecture me about being ungrateful. I stayed, because I was ashamed, because I didn't want to admit I'd made a mistake, because he convinced me no one else would ever love me, that I was lucky he put up with me despite all my flaws, that without him I was nothing. That's not true, Scott said quietly. I know that now, but for years I believed it. I believed I deserved it, that if I could just be better, be perfect, he'd stop being angry. So I tried. God, I tried so hard, but nothing was ever enough. She looked up at him, her grey-blue eyes red from unshed tears. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought maybe it would change things. Maybe becoming a father would soften him. Maybe he'd be different. I was so naive. He wasn't happy when I told him. He was furious. Said we hadn't planned this, that I should have been more careful. Like I'd gotten pregnant on purpose to trap him. But after a few days, he seemed to accept it, even seemed excited. Talked about having a son to carry on his legacy. I thought maybe this was it. Maybe this baby would save us. But he wasn't. He got worse. So much worse. He hates that I'm pregnant. Says I'm not sexy anymore. That I disgust him. That looking at me makes him sick. He won't touch me. Won't even sleep in the same bed anymore. Says he'll come back to me after I fix myself post-pregnancy. Nova's hand went to her belly, protective and gentle. And the hitting didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. He's careful now. Doesn't hit my stomach. He wouldn't want to damage his air, as he calls it. But everywhere else is fair game. Last week he shoved me so hard I fell down the stairs. I'm lucky I didn't lose the baby. Lucky I didn't break anything. He stood at the top of the stairs and said, "You need to be more careful. It would be terrible if something happened to my son because you're so clumsy." Like it was my fault, like I'd thrown myself down the stairs. Her voice cracked. "I don't know how to leave him, Scott. I don't have money of my own. No job, nowhere to go. My mom died 2 years ago. I don't have siblings. No real friends left. He made sure of that. And the baby. What if he fights for custody? He has lawyers. He has money. He has power. What if he takes my baby from me?" Scott shook his head. "He's wrong. You're beautiful. And you're brave. It takes courage to admit what you just told me." Nova's eyes filled with tears. "I don't feel brave. I feel terrified." "That's okay. You don't have to do this alone. Elena will help you. I'll help you. We'll figure this out." "Why?" Nova asked. "Why are you doing this for me? You don't even know me." Scott thought about how to answer that. Finally, he said, "I have a son, 7 years old, and every day I try to teach him to do the right thing, to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. Last night I had a choice. I could have walked away, pretended I didn't see what was happening. But if I'd done that, how could I look my son in the eye and tell him to be brave?" Nova reached across the table and took his hand. "Your son is lucky to have you. I'm lucky to have him." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Nova said, "Okay, I'll meet with your lawyer friend. But Scott, you need to be careful. Preston is dangerous. If he finds out you're helping me, he'll come after you." "Let him," Scott said. "I'm not afraid of him." But that was a lie. Scott was terrified, because he knew Nova was right. Preston Hawthorne was dangerous, and Scott Bailey had just declared war on a man who could destroy him with a phone call. Over the next 2 weeks, Scott learned just how far Preston Hawthorne's reach extended. First, he was blacklisted. Every janitorial company in Dallas suddenly had no openings. Every construction job he applied for turned him down without explanation. Even temp agencies stopped returning his calls. Then the bills started coming. Overdue notices, late fees. His landlord called, saying there'd been complaints about noise from his apartment. Complaints Scott knew were fabricated. His truck broke down. The mechanic said someone had put sugar in the gas tank. And through it all, Scott kept helping Nova. Elena met with her 3 times. They built a case, documented the abuse, found a safe house where Nova could stay once she left, prepared restraining orders. But Nova was still scared. "He'll find me," she kept saying. "He always finds me." "Not this time," Elena promised. "We're going to make sure you're protected." Scott believed her. He had to, because if he didn't, he'd lose hope. And hope was all he had left. One night, Scott was walking home from the grocery store, his truck still in the shop, when a black SUV pulled up beside him. The window rolled down. Preston Hawthorne stared at him from the driver's seat. "Get in," Preston said. Scott's heart pounded. "No thanks." It wasn't a request. 2 men got out of the back seat. Big men. Security, probably. They flanked Scott. "Get in the car, Mr. Bailey," one of them said. Scott had no choice. He climbed into the back seat. Preston didn't look at him, just started driving. They drove in silence for 10 minutes. Finally, Preston pulled into an empty parking lot and turned around. "You're a persistent little cockroach, aren't you?" Preston said. Scott said nothing. "I've tried to make your life difficult, tried to send you a message, but you keep helping my wife. Why?" "Because it's the right thing to do." Preston laughed. "The right thing. How noble. Let me tell you something, Mr. Bailey. The right thing doesn't matter in the real world. Only power matters, and I have it. You don't." "Maybe not. But I have something you don't." "And what's that?" "A clear conscience." Preston's face darkened. "You think you're better than me?" "I think you're a coward who beats his pregnant wife because it makes you feel powerful." Preston's hand shot out and grabbed Scott by the throat. Scott gasped, clawing at Preston's fingers. "Listen to me very carefully," Preston hissed. "If you don't back off, I will destroy you. I will take your son. I will make sure you lose custody. I will make sure you end up in prison. Do you understand me?" Scott couldn't breathe. His vision started to blur. Then Preston let go. Scott gasped, coughing. "Stay away from my wife," Preston said, "or I'll make you wish you'd never been born." He nodded to his security guards. They grabbed Scott and threw him out of the car. Scott hit the pavement hard, scraping his hands and knees. The SUV drove away, leaving Scott alone in the dark parking lot. He sat there for a long time, shaking, not from fear, from rage. Preston Hawthorne had just threatened his son, and that was a line Scott wouldn't let anyone cross. He pulled out his phone and called Elena. "We're moving forward," he said. "Now, whatever it takes." The plan was simple. Nova would leave Preston on a Friday night while he was at a business dinner. She'd go straight to the safe house Elena had arranged. On Monday they'd file for divorce and a restraining order, but nothing ever goes according to plan. On Thursday night, Scott got a call from Nova. She was crying so hard he could barely understand her. "He knows," she sobbed. "He knows I'm planning to leave. He found the papers. Her voice broke into screams. "Nova? Nova, what's happening?" The line went dead. Scott didn't think. He grabbed his keys and ran. He drove to the Hawthorne estate, a massive property in Highland Park, surrounded by gates and security. He didn't care. He pulled up to the gate and started honking. "Let me in," he shouted. A security guard appeared. "Sir, you need to leave." "Not until I see Nova Hawthorne." "Sir, she's in danger. Let me in." The guard spoke into his radio. A moment later, the gates opened. Scott drove up the long driveway and screeched to a stop in front of the house. He jumped out and ran to the door. It was already open. Inside, he heard shouting, a crash, a scream. Scott ran toward the sound. He found them in the living room, a massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows and white furniture. Nova was on the floor, her face bruised, her lip bleeding. Preston stood over her, his hand raised. "Get away from her," Scott said. Preston turned. His face was twisted with rage. "You? Yeah, me. How dare you come into my home? How dare you hit your wife?" Preston lunged at Scott. They crashed into a table, shattering a vase. Scott fought back. He wasn't a fighter, but desperation made him strong. They grappled, throwing punches, crashing into furniture. Then Scott saw it. A letter opener on the desk. Preston saw it too. They both dove for it. Preston got there first. Scott froze as Preston raised the letter opener, his eyes wild. "You should have minded your own business," Preston hissed. But before he could strike, a voice cut through the room. "Drop it! Now!" Everyone turned. Nova stood in the doorway, a phone in her hand. "I called the police. They're on their way, and I've been recording everything." Preston's face went white. "Nova, it's over, Preston. I'm done." For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Preston lowered the letter opener. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Preston looked at Scott. "You've ruined everything." "No," Scott said. "You did that yourself." The police arrived. They arrested Preston on charges of domestic assault. Nova showed them the recording, the bruises, the medical records Elena had helped her compile. Preston Hawthorne, Billionaire CEO, was led away in handcuffs, and for the first time in years, Nova was free. 6 months later, Scott stood in a courtroom, watching as the judge finalized Nova's divorce. Preston had tried to fight it. He'd hired 3 different law firms, filed motion after motion, tried to claim Nova was mentally unstable, that she'd fabricated the abuse, that she was an unfit mother. But the evidence was overwhelming, the recording from that night, the medical records Elena had helped Nova compile, years of emergency room visits for accidents and falls. Testimony from the security guard at the Hawthorne estate, who'd seen Preston drag Nova by her hair across the driveway. Testimony from Richard Caldwell about what he'd witnessed at the gala, and most damning of all, testimony from 2 of Preston's previous girlfriends who'd come forward after seeing the news coverage. Women he'd dated before Nova, both of whom had restraining orders against him. Both of whom told similar stories of charm turning to control, turning to violence. Preston's lawyers had tried everything, but in the end, the truth won. The judge had granted Nova full custody, with Preston allowed only supervised visits, which everyone knew he'd never actually show up for. He'd been ordered to pay child support and spousal support. His company's board had quietly asked him to step down after the publicity. Several of his biggest clients had pulled their contracts. Preston Hawthorne, the man who'd once seemed untouchable, had lost everything that mattered: his reputation, his power, his control, and Nova was free. She walked out of the courthouse into the bright Dallas sunshine, Scott beside her. She was 8 months pregnant now, her belly round under a simple blue dress. Her hair was down, natural waves instead of the tight updo Preston had always demanded. She wore no makeup, no diamonds, no designer labels, and she was glowing. "Thank you," she said to Scott, turning to face him on the courthouse steps. "For everything. I wouldn't be here without you." "You did this," Scott said firmly. "You found the courage to leave. You testified against him. You fought for your freedom. That was all you. I couldn't have done it without you." Nova's eyes filled with tears. Happy tears this time. "You were the first person to make me believe I deserved better, that I wasn't crazy or weak or worthless. You saved my life, Scott." Scott shook his head. "You saved your own life. I just reminded you that you could." Nova reached out and took his hand. "What will you do now?" Scott smiled. "Keep going. For Caleb. Richard gave me a promotion. Facilities manager at the Indigo House. Better pay. Day shift, so I can be home with Caleb at night. Things are looking up. He's lucky to have you." "I'm lucky to have him." Scott paused. "And you? What will you do?" "Start over. I got a job. Administrative work at a non-profit. It doesn't pay much, but it's mine. I earned it myself." Nova's smile was radiant. "I found an apartment. It's small, nothing like the mansion, but it's mine. No one telling me how to decorate it or what furniture to buy or whether I'm allowed to have plants. It's mine." She placed her hand on her belly. "And in a month, this little girl is going to be born into freedom, not into Preston's world of control and perfection and impossible expectations, into a small apartment with a mother who loves her and will protect her and will teach her that she's worthy just as she is." "A girl?" Scott's smile widened. "You found out?" "Last week. I'm naming her Hope." Nova laughed at Scott's expression. "I know it's on the nose, but I don't care, because that's what you gave me. Hope. When I thought there was none left. And I was thinking," Nova's voice became more serious, "maybe I could help other women like me, start a foundation or something. Give them the legal help I got from Elena, the safe housing, the support, everything I needed but didn't know how to ask for. I want to be the person for someone else that you were for me." "That's a great idea," Scott said. "You'd be amazing at that." Eleanor said she'd help, said she has connections with other lawyers who do pro bono work, and Richard Caldwell offered to make a donation to get it started. He said what happened at the gala opened his eyes to how many women must be silently suffering at his events, and he wants to be part of the solution. Nova looked at Scott. "I was hoping you might want to be involved too. Not running it or anything. I know you have Caleb and your job, but maybe on the board. Your perspective, someone who just did the right thing without thinking about the consequences. I think that would be valuable." Scott thought about it, about using what happened to help others, about turning his choice into something bigger than just that one night. "Yeah," he said. "I'd like that." Nova hugged him. "If you ever need anything, call me. You and Caleb both. You're family now. You don't owe me anything." "I know, but that doesn't mean I'm not grateful." But as Scott walked away from the courthouse, climbing into his slightly less beat-up truck, he'd been able to afford some repairs with the promotion. He felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride, not the arrogant kind, not pride in being better than someone else, but the quiet pride that comes from knowing you did the right thing. That when it mattered, when everything was on the line, you chose courage over comfort, pride in the choice he'd made, the choice to stand up when everyone else sat down, to speak out when everyone else stayed silent, to be the kind of man his son could be proud of. Because sometimes the right thing is also the hardest thing, and sometimes a janitor can pull down an empire, not with money, not with power, but with courage and love. The kind of love that says, your life matters, your pain matters, you deserve better, and I'll stand with you until you're safe. That's the kind of love that changes the world. A year later, Scott stood in the kitchen of his new apartment, bigger than the old one, thanks to the promotion Richard Caldwell had given him. 2 bedrooms instead of 1. Caleb finally had his own room, with a real bed instead of a bunk, though he still insisted on keeping Beery on his pillow every night. A kitchen with actual counter space. A living room where Scott's mattress wasn't on the floor. It wasn't luxurious, but it was theirs. And it was enough. The fridge had new drawings now. Caleb's artwork covered almost every inch. Pictures of their new apartment, pictures of his 3rd grade class, pictures of Mrs. Regina, who still baked him cookies and watched him sometimes when Scott had to work late, and pictures of Nova and baby Hope. Caleb sat at the kitchen table now, working on a new drawing. Scott was making dinner. Actual dinner. Not just cereal, spaghetti with meat sauce, garlic bread, a salad. Simple food, but more than they'd had in years. "Who's that?" Scott asked, looking over Caleb's shoulder at the picture. "That's us," Caleb said, pointing to each figure with his crayon. "That's you, that's me, and that's Miss Nova and baby Hope." The picture showed 4 stick figures holding hands. A tall man, a smaller boy, a woman, and a tiny baby, all of them smiling. "That's a great picture, buddy. We're a family now, right?" Caleb looked up at him with those bright brown eyes. "I mean, not like married or anything, but like, we love each other. So that makes us a family." Scott's throat tightened. "Yeah, champ, we're a family." Because they were. In the year since the gala, since Nova's divorce, since everything changed, they'd built something together. Not a romance, not yet, though Scott couldn't deny there were feelings there, growing slowly, carefully, like flowers after a long winter. But a friendship, a support system, a chosen family. Nova came over for dinner twice a week, baby Hope in her arms. The infant was 4 months old now, with her mother's dark hair and grey-blue eyes. She'd smile when she saw Scott, reaching her tiny hands toward him. And Scott, who hadn't held a baby in 7 years, had learned how to change diapers again, how to make bottles, how to rock a crying infant until she fell asleep. Caleb adored her, treated her like a little sister, would sit for hours making funny faces to make her laugh, would help Nova with whatever she needed, fetching burp cloths or pacifiers or toys. And Nova had bloomed. That was the only word for it. Without Preston's control, without the constant criticism and fear, she'd become herself again, laughed freely, wore comfortable clothes, ate whatever she wanted, made her own choices. She'd started the Parker Foundation 6 months ago, named after her maiden name, not Hawthorne. It helped survivors of domestic violence with legal aid, safe housing, job training, counseling. Elena ran the legal side. Richard Caldwell had donated enough to rent a small office space. And other donors had come forward, people who'd been moved by Nova's story. In 6 months, they'd helped 17 women leave abusive situations. 17 women and 23 children who were now safe, who had a chance at a new life. Scott served on the board, attending monthly meetings, sharing his perspective. The perspective of someone who'd just seen something wrong and couldn't walk away. His story had inspired others to speak up, to report abuse they'd witnessed, to stop being silent bystanders. "Dad?" Caleb's voice pulled him back to the present. "Are you a hero?" Scott thought about that, about the night at the gala that had changed everything, about the choice he'd made, terrified, trembling, but unable to stay silent, about everything that had happened since, about Nova, free and strong and building a life on her own terms, about baby Hope, growing up in freedom instead of fear, about the 17 women whose lives had been changed because one person chose to speak up, about Caleb, who'd learned that doing the right thing matters, even when it's hard. "Nobody," Scott said finally, ruffling his son's hair. "I'm not a hero. I'm just a dad who tried to do the right thing." Caleb smiled, that bright, gap-toothed smile that made everything worth it. That's what heroes do, though. They do the right thing even when it's scary. And maybe, Scott thought, his son was right. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand up when everyone else sits down, speak out when everyone else stays silent, help when everyone else walks away. It doesn't make you special. It doesn't make you better than anyone else. It makes you human. It makes you someone who saw another person's pain and couldn't look away. And sometimes that one choice, that one moment of courage, ripples out in ways you never expected, changes lives you'll never meet, inspires courage in others who were waiting for permission to be brave. That's more powerful than any empire, more valuable than any fortune, more lasting than any legacy a billionaire could build. Because empires crumble, fortunes fade, power shifts. But the choice to love, to protect, to stand up for someone who can't stand up for themselves, that echoes forever. The doorbell rang. Scott glanced at the clock. 6 p.m. Right on time. Caleb jumped up. "I'll get it." He ran to the door and threw it open. "Miss Nova, Hope!" Nova stood in the doorway, baby Hope in a carrier, a casserole dish in her hands. She looked tired. Single motherhood was exhausting, but happy. Genuinely, deeply happy. "Hi, Caleb." "Hi, Scott. I brought lasagna. Hope helped me make it." She smiled. Well, she supervised from her bouncer. "Come in," Scott said, taking the dish from her. "I made spaghetti, so now we have 2 Italian dishes. I guess we're having a theme night." Nova laughed, that free, uninhibited laugh she'd found again after leaving Preston. "Perfect. I brought garlic bread too." Caleb was already unbuckling Hope from her carrier, carefully, the way Scott had taught him. "Can I hold her, Miss Nova?" "Of course, sweetie. Just support her head." Scott watched his son cradle the baby girl, watched Nova's grateful smile, watched the way they'd all found each other in the wreckage of their separate traumas and built something good. This was family, not perfect, not traditional, but real. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.